Resistance is respected, weakness is despised. There is nothing the communists respect more than strength. There is nothing they despise more than weakness. Just think of what you've seen in recent days at Columbia University in New York City. Weakness is despised. And you saw it during the BLM, burn, loot, murder riots in America, and Tifa has shown you how this works. They despise weakness. Telling police to stand back is insane. And all over the world you can see what happens when the police are handcuffed and restricted and intimidated, and the rioters are emboldened and encouraged. Burning, looting, murdering BLM, or Baal, Lucifer, and Moloch, as I like to call him. Throwing firebombs on police. And then in America, bizarrely, people coming and washing the feet of BLM protesters. Those people who think they can calm the situation by bowing to the mob or washing their feet or brushing or kissing their boots are insane. To see American police disgracing themselves and their profession by bowing to the mob and kneeling on their US flag, I mean, how much more contempt can they show for everything you stand for? And giving the clenched fist, the fist of rebellion against God, the Marxist salute. And here you got police in Sweden bowing to the mob protesting. Insane. And here's some stupid Swedish policewoman deciding to give the clenched fist salute while bowing to the mob. And of course, you've had senators, congressmen doing similarly up in Congress. Never bow to bullies. In my experience, it's absolutely essential that you never give Marxist bullies or mobs 1 millimeter. If you give them an inch, they will take a mile. You give them your finger, they'll take your arm. Being brought up in war-torn Rhodesia and experiencing terrorism and revolution, and working in war-torn communist Angola and Mozambique, being imprisoned in communist Zambia and Mozambique, and in so many other cases I've seen, the more steadfastly and strongly you stand, the better. The moment the Marxists sense weakness, fear, or compromise, they smell blood, and they will only howl for more, and they'll escalate their unreasonable demands. One of the members of Frontline First was Colonel Jan Breitenbach. He is a South African legend. Colonel Jan Breitenbach was the founder of the South African Reconnaissance Commando. He is one of our first paratroopers as well, Parabats, 1961. He was involved in 64 different conflicts and battles. He was involved in the largest airdrop combat operation in South African history, and not since the Second World War have so many paratroopers been dropped at one place in Africa. And that was the Battle of Kasinga, 1978. He led a South African paratroop assault on the enemy headquarters in Angola, and Colonel Breitenbach is visible in the middle there with some of his troops during the raid. And these are some of South Africa's paratroopers who had flown into Angola to destroy the SWAPO terrorist base in Angola. And this has been put in book format, Eagle Strike, by Colonel Jan Breitenbach. He also flew into Angola during the Angolan Civil War, and behind enemy lines recruited thousands, over 3,000 black Portuguese-speaking ex-communists recruited into the South African Army, forged them in battle in 3-2 Battalion, Buffalo Battalion, with their distinctive camouflage hats, and they were forged in battle, and 3-2 Battalion became some of South Africa's most elite infantry unit. They lost more men in combat and killed more enemy than all our other infantry battalions combined. And so these were the so-called Buffalo Soldiers of 3-2 Battalion, a very elite fighting unit, and 3-2 Battalion was recruited by Colonel Breitenbach. Colonel Breitenbach was an extraordinary person, and this is Colonel Eddie Viljoen, one of his successors who I've met as well, who ran the unit after him. And it's hard to believe that we used to have units like this. When Colonel Breitenbach retired from the army, he joined Frontline Fellowship. And when I got his application in the mail, I literally fell on my knees next to my desk and just prayed, Lord, give me wisdom. What do you do when one of your greatest military legends joins your little missionary unit? And Colonel Breitenbach and I worked throughout the border, ministering the gospel to soldiers in the combat areas, traveling in vehicles like this on areas where landmines were the national plant. And this armored vehicle of South Africa's detonated a treble-decker anti-tank mine, so that armor plating didn't protect them. The people in that cabin were dead. So even though you're in an armored vehicle traveling in these areas, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that you'll survive a landmine. Well, in the early days of Frontline Fellowship, we worked throughout the South African Army and Southwest African Territorial Force. I preached at least 1,200 times in chaplain services, meetings all over Southwest Africa, what today is Namibia and Angola, and having Bible study and prayer meetings with them. This was often accommodation at night, a ground sheet as our only protection from the rain, and our ration pack and water bottle. And this was the way I normally start my day. And that's not coffee or tea in my mug. That would normally be water with a vitamin drink. That's been my standard for a long time. The R4, our 5.56 millimeter, I think you know them as the Galil. South Africa produced them in cooperation with Israel. And Colonel Breitenbach speaking to some of the military in the briefing room. The sand in front of us is where they would often make up the operational map of this is the base we're going to attack, or this is the situation. So they'd work it out in the sand or build little models. One of our bomb shelters, holding a prayer meeting and Bible meeting. One of the halls for meeting with the soldiers, lectures and preaching. Preaching in the rain to the soldiers up at the frontier on the border. Colonel Breitenbach was a legend to go around, and the South African soldiers just were in awe of him. He's the most combat decorated, experienced soldier in South African history. And we had the opportunity of preaching to tens of thousands of soldiers throughout the border areas. Well, at one point, I woke up one morning and Colonel Breitenbach in the sleeping bag opposite me said, "Peter, let's go into Angola. Let's preach to the communists." And so we crossed the border into communist Angola, and it was during a ceasefire, but we were going to go and preach to the enemy. And this is one of the times there's Colonel Breitenbach next to me with his arms behind his head, and there were Marxists all around us. We had Cubans, all kinds of communist weaponry surrounding us, and we had a 3-2 battalion soldier who came along as our translator to translate into Portuguese so that the enemy could hear what we were saying. And Colonel Breitenbach stood up and he said, "I'm Colonel Jan Breitenbach of 3-2 battalion. My men and I, we've killed thousands of you communists, thousands. We never had any trouble killing you. Our problem was catching you. You ran so fast. You broke Olympic records running away from the fight. Even when you outnumbered us, 10 to 1, 100 to 1, you still fled like the spineless, yellow-bellied cowards you are. Why are you so afraid of fighting? You're afraid to die. And you should be afraid to die. If you knew what was waiting for you 1 second on the other side of the grave." He said, "Your God is Karl Marx. Your religion is atheism. Your commissars are the priests of Satan. You're all damned. You're doomed. You're lost. You're going to burn in hell forever. If you knew what was waiting for you on the other side of the grave, you'd crawl across the minefield and beg 3-2 battalion to show you the way of salvation in Jesus Christ." I'll never forget that sermon. I mean, that's Colonel Breitenbach at his best. And he preached like he fought, straight for the enemy. And the enemy was so shocked by this, my hand went to my 9mm on my hip. I thought the colonel wants a short way to glory. I didn't think I'd see the sunset that day. And yet the communists are standing around holding their AKs, their PKMs, their RPDs, their RPGs. And I thought they'd do something, but they just stood there absolutely riveted, listening to what the colonel had to say. And I stood up and I preached him too. I said, "You say you don't believe in God, but you spend so much time fighting God. You know there's a God. You've seen him in the eyes of the pastors you've murdered. You're brave when you are tying someone up with his hands behind his back with wire and you're bayoneting him in the back. But when you face real soldiers, you run. And you know there's a God. That's why you're fighting him." And so we preached the gospel on 3 different occasions at different places across the border that day. And on no occasion did the communists retaliate. They were just too spineless. When we got home that night, the colonel and I felt really good about ourselves. We'd had a great day. As we came into the base, the commandant, which is like a lieutenant colonel, greeted us saying, "Colonel, the wires have been humming to the bastion today." The bastion was the military headquarters for Southwest Africa in Windhoek. And Pick Botha was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Pick is hopping mad, and the orders are you and Hammond are to be expelled from the country forthwith. So we're in Southwest Africa, we're fighting the communists. Colonel Breitmach fired the first shot to the war back in 1966, and here he's been banned from the country that he has dedicated his life to fighting to defend. And so we were out by the next day, by order of our Foreign Affairs Minister, who said, you and Hammond are trying to restart the war. And, the story is in Confronting Communists with the Gospel, which is a chapter in my book, Behind Enemy Lines for Christ, but it's also an article on our website. When I marched 30,000 people to Parliament in Cape Town to oppose President Nelson Mandela's secular state policies, I was summoned to the President's mansion. And so we're marching against Mandela's attempts to paganize our country. This Grondwet op Kotsewet says constitution must be based upon the law of God. Constitution upon God's word, or God's law. And the people protested that they were trying to kick out acknowledging Almighty God from our constitution. Cyril Ramaphosa was the chairman of the Constitutional Assembly, and they were trying to write a new constitution, and they had kicked out God. They were kicking out censorship. You were going to legalize pornography, blasphemy, prostitution, all these evils, legalize abortion. So we marched upon, we protested. I read out a memorandum against this. And interesting, first time I met Cyril Ramaphosa. Cyril Ramaphosa was pushed out the door, and he came to us, big, wide eyes. I mean, he looked terrified. They'd never seen such a large march before, and I think they were afraid. I was told later by people inside Parliament, the ANC thought their days had come to end, that they were going to be hanging from the lamppost by the end of the day. And but of course, Christian protesters don't behave like that. We had every intention of being peaceful. We didn't break anything. And so Cyril Ramaphosa standing at the foot of we've got a little ladder leading up to our back of a pickup truck, which is our platform for speaking. And he's looking around. He saw a Zulu friend of mine, Fana Sabisi, and he said, brother, can I borrow your Bible? Now, Fana Sabisi had a leather-bound Bible that my father-in-law had bought for him in Arizona, and it actually had engraved in gold Reverend Fana Sabisi on the cover. So without waiting for the answer, Cyril Ramaphosa grabs Fana Sabisi's Bible, goes up the ladder onto the platform, and he starts off by lifting up the Bible and saying, look, I'm also a Christian. See, I bring my Bible with me to Parliament every day. That's the man who's now the President of South Africa. And Fana and I just swapped expressions of, we knew he was lying, he knew that we knew he was lying, but most of the crowd did not. And you can tell when a politician is lying, can't you? His lips move. And when he dies, he lies still. Polyticks, many ticks, blood-sucking parasites. Polyticks, many blood-sucking parasites. Well, the crowd, unfortunately, was eating out of his hand within seconds. But I made a strong stand back to the Bible. And at this particular occasion, we had a man from the government, this chap here to my left, was from the President's office. And he said, President Mandela, Madiba, that's what they call him, Madiba, wants to see you on Tuesday. So this is Tuesday. He wants to see me on Thursday, 2 days' time, at the Kruger estate, the house that Cecil Rhodes built, which is the President's mansion in Cape Town. So the first words Mandela said to me when I met him at his mansion was, what were you doing during the years of struggle? Now, struggle is their words for the war. Not that it was a real war, it was more like terrorism, planting landmines, burning policemen, petrol bombs at night, just terrorism. But, Mr. Hammond, what were you doing during the years of struggle? And my response was, fighting people like you, sir. And Mandela smiled and he laughed and he got up from his couch and he came over and he shook my hand again. He said, I'm so glad to meet an honest white man. All the other whites I've met have told me how they always opposed apartheid and were actually supporting me. So he said, I wondered how the National Party stayed in power for over 44 years while all the whites actually opposed the National Party and supported me. My response was, well, make no mistake, Mr. President, we were not fighting for apartheid. We were fighting against communism. We were fighting against terrorism. His response was, apartheid is the greatest evil in the history of the world. So my response was, I cannot agree with you, Mr. President. That prize must go to your friends and your supporters, the communists. He had just welcomed Fidel Castro, the longest reigning dictator in the world, to South Africa and gave him the biggest award anyone could get in South Africa, and had him speak to our joint sitting of our Senate and our House of Parliament. So joint sitting of the House, Castro got the privilege of speaking to them all. And Mandela was a long-standing friend of Castro, and not to mention all the other Marxists. So I then gave him a recounting of the atrocity of the communists, said, that prize must go to your communists. Your friends have littered the 20th century with over 160 million corpses, not foreign people killed in the time of war, but their own people, killed by their own governments in times of peace, as documented by Professor Rommel's Death by Government and the Black Book of Communism, which was written by ex-communists using the communists' own files and records. Over 66 million people were slaughtered under communism in the Soviet Union, under Lenin, Stalin, Brezhnev, Khrushchev. And another 69 million slaughtered in Red China under Mao Zedong. And I went through a whole list of Castro, Pol Pot, Cambodia, even Mengistu in Ethiopia, who had killed millions, and who was a friend and being hosted by Mandela at that very moment, who was wanted for genocide by the International Court of Justice, but Mandela was protecting him in South Africa at that time. So I rattled through a few of these facts. And in fact, there's no doubt the communists have murdered more Christians in the 20th century than any other, even more than the Muslims have. And that's a reality. When I want to talk about apartheid, well, remember, the context was the Soviet Union and the Cold War. We were seeking to defend our country against communism, and so I just remind him of some of these facts, and because he was silent, I just carried on working my way through some of the facts. But just look at all the countries that fell to communism from the First World War, Versailles Treaty, and then, of course, at the end of the Second World War, and how under Ronald Reagan, praise God, we had a precipitous drop of communist countries in the world because of America resisting communism for a change, after all the craven cowardice and treachery of the Jimmy Carter years and so on. Well, Mandela then said, when I was a prisoner of the Boers, they would not allow me to wear sunglasses. Now, my response was, well, sir, my eyes are also very sensitive, and I can understand how unpleasant and uncomfortable it must have been. But I'm sure you'll agree that hardly compares with the atrocities documented by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago. And by the way, here's a picture of Nelson Mandela with his sunglasses. He claims that the Boers never allowed him to wear sunglasses. But there's a picture given in the Nelson Mandela Museum going to Robben Island, where your Clintons have gone to burn incense in his cell and things like that. He also said that the Boers never allowed him to wear long trousers. Well, here we've got photographic proof that they did. So maybe he's talking about the first few months, but it's not accurate. And also, here's a picture of Nelson Mandela in Addis Ababa being trained as a terrorist by the Cuban DGI. And apparently even Che Guevara was part of his trainers. The man was a well-known terrorist. He trained in Algeria. And so at one point, Mandela expressed his surprise that we were wanting to restrict the rights of women by opposing abortion. He was championing legalization of abortion at that moment. So I responded, Mr. President, you are questioning the Christianity of people who 40 years ago justified apartheid. It will not be 40 years from now, people will question your humanity for legalizing abortion. You're seeking to replace apartheid with abortion. And abortion is worse than apartheid. It's not just restricting the area a person lives or giving them separate beaches or separate cinemas or restaurants, but it's not just restricting their right to vote. It's taking away their life before they get to breathe their first breath of air. Abortion does not just place the baby on a separate voter's roll or restrict where they can live or swim. Abortion takes the baby's life. Life begins at conception. Abortion is the violent taking of an innocent life. Every abortion stops a beating heart. And I then said to him, abortion is the worst type of apartheid. It separates a baby from its mother and from its life support. At its most crucial stage of development, you're seeking to replace discrimination on the basis of race with discrimination on the basis of age. Well, we went back and forth like a tennis match, and at the end of the hour, Nelson Mandela stood up and told us, You can now take your pictures. Now, I didn't mean to be rude, and I honestly hadn't even thought about it. I hadn't even brought a camera for the day. I just said, no, thank you. And his mouth dropped in shock. Perhaps we were the first delegation to meet him who didn't want to have pictures taken with him. What would I do with a picture of me and Mandela? But then I said, but we would like to pray for you. And he said, no, that's very private and personal. So I pretended not to hear, and I placed a hand on one shoulder Germany's Zoon Zevenster, who was with me, placed a hand on the other shoulder, and we prayed. We prayed that the Lord would not grant Mr. Mandela any peace until he did what he knew was right, until he introduced legislation for the protection of helpless, innocent babies from the violence and injustice of abortion. And I prayed that Mr. Mandela would find no peace until he found peace in Christ by bowing the knee and surrendering to Almighty God to do his will. At the end of our Passion Prayer, I handed over a book from Dr. James Kennedy, and Mr. Mandela thanked us and assured us he is always responsive to the concerns of our constituency, and that his door is always open should we have any concerns. That was Thursday. We marched on Tuesday. That was Thursday. Monday morning, senior investigators of the Inland Revenue Service knocked on our door and began a 7-year audit of our mission family. They went back 6 years. They carried on for 7. A 13-year audit of myself, my wife, and every ministry I was involved in. We had to hire a special accountant and lawyer just to keep us out of jail. The initial assessment was we owed them millions, which would have destroyed our mission. We had no such funds. And I had people saying, like the lawyer we went to, he said, this is ridiculous. You're very small fry as things go in terms of funding. I mean, our budget was minuscule. And these were senior investigators in the Inland Revenue Service who wasted 13 years in auditing our little mission. But that's the kind of person Mandela was, charming to our face, vindictive behind our back. So another occasion, 1995, I was summoned to Parliament to give a submission to their subcommittee on their draft publications bill. Effectively, they were seeking to legalize pornography and blasphemy. And we, of course, were opposing this. So I'd sometimes be invited to Parliament into this very chamber. This is the old Assembly's chamber, National Assembly chamber, in which our Prime Minister, Hendrik Verwoerd, was stabbed to death right by the Prime Minister's desk, the front, by a communist, Safundis, who later was not tried. He was put into an insane asylum and released later in life when Mandela came to power. So because he was not tried, not judged fit to try, the evidence didn't come out of it. How was a communist who was expelled from the country working in Parliament as a messenger that he had the right to access right up to the Prime Minister, and he stabbed him to death. Interesting enough, he, according to Stephen Mitford Goodson's book on Hendrik Verwoerd, this Safundis was a victim of MK Ultra, and the same people who assassinated your John F. Kennedy were involved in the assassination of our Prime Minister, Hendrik Verwoerd, who also was planning to abolish our South African Reserve Bank, which isn't South African, has no reserves, and isn't a bank. And so, interestingly, there were 2 assassination attempts on our Prime Minister Verwoerd, and both men were judged insane, and both men were being cared for by the very same Communist Party member psychiatrist. No conspiracy to see here, though. So I was in Parliament, and after the presentation, the ANC MP said, have you ever apologized for what you did in the South African Defence Force? So I answered, are you wanting me to apologize for what I did in the South African Defence Force? I'm sorry we didn't kill all of you. You were not freedom fighters, you were terrorists. You didn't attack our military bases, you attacked civilians, black civilians. You burned over 1,000 black South Africans with a brutal necklace murder. You burned, these are town councillors, mayors. You planted landmines in dirt roads. You killed whole families. You planted landmines in roads leading to schools. You killed school children coming in school buses on their way to school. This used to be a combi or a van. Can you imagine? You kidnapped young children from schools. You took them across the border to brutalize them and train them for your terrorist groups. You murdered many. You raped the girls. You threw hand grenades through the windows into black policemen's homes at night. You petrol bombed the homes of black town councillors and mayors. You used car bombs, limpet mines. You blatantly targeted civilians. You are hypocrites, like the Church Street bombing, which the IRA, by the way, helped them to plan. Murdered huge amounts of people. I mean, this is a Church Street bombing in Pretoria, 1983. And we had to have signs like this all over our shopping centers for people to recognize these weapons, all Soviet bloc, produced in Russia or China. And the kind of landmines, grenades, limpet mines, these were the tools of terror, as documented by Henry Pike's book, A History of Communism in South Africa. So I continued my rant in Parliament. You speak against racism, then you laugh and applaud and give standing ovations to the worst racist on the planet today, Robert Mugabe, dictator of Zimbabwe. And here's a picture of Robert Mugabe's police whipping black Christians in the main street of Harare, which is Samora Machel Avenue. They were having a prayer march for peace. They're getting whipped and beaten. These are women praying for justice outside a government, whom I think this Home Affairs, getting beaten by the police. This is Zimbabwe. And this is freedom and liberation for black people in Zimbabwe under Mugabe. You have no right to ever again speak against racism when you so obviously applaud, endorse, and enthusiastically practice racism. I'm sorry we ended the war before thoroughly and completely eradicating all of you communists. Now there's a stunned, awkward silence for a time. Then the chairman said, right, let us move on to our next point. They never brought up the subject again. That is the only way you can deal with Marxists, with guilt manipulators, with gaslighters and thugs and terrorists. There is nothing they respect more than strength. There's nothing they despise more than weakness. Napoleon observed he could not believe the foolishness of King Louis XVI in not ordering his men to open fire on the mob. This is what he did on the 5th of October 1795, which led to Napoleon becoming leader in France and then the emperor. Napoleon Bonaparte was adamant, you cannot reason with a mob. Throughout history it's been understood the only way to deal with arsonists and looters is to shoot them, which is what Napoleon did. He opened fire on a mob with artillery, gave them what he called the whiff of grape shot. And that's what ended the French Revolution and brought about the empire under Napoleon, because Napoleon said, you cannot reason with a mob. There's not one innocent person in a mob. Shoot them all in the street. That's the end of the... You won't have another riot after that. Those who advise the police to stand back or stand down during the threats to life and property, they're unraveling the foundations of civilization. There can be nothing worse than mob rule anarchy. It used to be, if you loot, we shoot. And that's the only way to deal with looters. You can't try and appease to them, debate to them, argue with them. The burn, loot, murder plan to defund the police does not mean a police-free state, by the way, because Marxists want control. I've been to many communist countries in the world. They've all got police forces, and they've all got secret police forces. Just as a matter of example, under the Tsar of Russia, there was an average of 65 people executed every year for, murder and assassinations and rape and so on. And he had a secret police that was about 3,000 strong. And under Lenin and Stalin, they had a secret police of 3 million, and they murdered an average of 150,000 a year. So that's the difference between oppression under the Tsar and liberation under the Commissar. So defund the police does not mean a future where there's no police. It means a future where Antifa are your police. The plan to defund the police and disarm the police and disband the organized professional police force, which is mostly conservative and generally pro-Trump, is just a beginning, because what they want is they want their warlords, their gangs, to replace the existing professional police force with BLM, Antifa revolutionaries in a police uniform. That's what defund the police means. It means revolutionize the police, break down to build up better, build back better. This would be followed by gun confiscations, and you know how that ends. Every genocide begins with gun control. Now, here's just a few pictures to show you how justice works in Africa. This is what happens after you've defunded the police. You've got a new form of tyranny, and this is the way the revolutionaries deal with their black civilians. See those people tied up by their ankles? And this is normal in Africa. The issue is never the issue. The issue is the revolution. Just take the French Revolution of 1789 and the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and the Cultural Revolution in China. How many more times must we see this agenda worked out before people understand what Curtis Bauer documented in his video Agenda, Masters of Deceit? The issue is never the issue. The issue is the revolution. They might use black, white. They might use bourgeois, employees, employers. They might use the gender issue. They might be using black against white. But that's never the issue. That's just the pretext. Let us never be guilty of sacrificing any portion of truth on the altar of peace. When they talk about coexisting, you can't coexist with people who want to kill you. We are more than conquerors through God Jesus who loved us. Submit to God, resist the devil, he will flee from you. Greater is he who is in you than him who is in the world. We need to stand up, step out, and fight the good fight of faith. We need to smash cultural Marxism. This cancel culture is nothing other than cancel Christianity. Now, you will see on our website, frontlinemissionsa.org, a lot of audio-visual resources which will have screen captures on different lectures we've given, PowerPoints, links to our sermon audio, and our newsletters available, and a lot of articles from around Africa in particular where the church is being persecuted. We've got a From the Frontline podcast where I tackle these things audio every week, and I've got a very few copies of the From the Frontline book here, which is my testimony and that of our mission amongst the persecuted church. It gives the behind the news headline stories of what really happened in Africa. And one of the exciting things going on in South Africa right now is the Cape Independence movement. We are moving for secession, and I'm the chairman of the Cape Independence Forum, and we have marches for freedom when we've got wide ranges of people marching through our city of Cape Town, calling for independence. Here at the provincial legislature, protesting against what they're doing, marching through the streets, getting a lot of support from the local population to free the Cape. And Cape Independence, Cape Exit is one of our slogans. And you can see the new flags. In fact, I've brought here a flag of the Cape Independence movement for Brother John, that you can have that as well as an example of what we stand for. We are producing a lot of books available free electronically online that people can get. The Real Story of Soweto, Right, Soweto But God, How the Soviets and Cubans Lost the War, The Chaplain's Handbook, Reformation 500, Christian Terror, which is Father Arthur Lewis. He is the first board member of Frontline Fellowship. He was an Anglican missionary to Rhodesia, and he's the one who exposed that the World Council of Churches was funding terrorists who were murdering Christians in Rhodesia. And that was even published in Reader's Digest at one point. And his book, Christian Terror, is out of print, so I reprinted it. His documentation led the Baptist and the Salvation Army to leave the World Council of Churches and protest. People are moving away from hymns, so we've produced the new Livingston Fellowship Reformation 500 hymn book, a discipleship training manual, and these are just some of the free books available on our website. Got lots of newsletters of what's going on in Sudan, the Congo, Nigeria, and other places we work. Because our postal service no longer works, people need to download it from the website or sign up on an email list, and I've got the clipboard here. I've got a few copies of these Frontline newsletters here. Please help yourself, but pass them on, circulate them, because unfortunately our postal service is so, well, not just unreliable, it just doesn't exist. We now have to do things electronically, and the few hard copies I can bring across the ocean need to just be circulated. And your pastor, John Weaver, also helped us with an introduction to our Security and Survival Handbook, which I know you've got copies of on the shelf over there. And Security and Survival Handbook is also key. We need to know how to resist. A lot of our Frontline book resources are now available electronically as print on demand or ebooks. But Christian Liberty Books is a book ministry we started in our mission back in 1995 after our march to Parliament, and this primarily provides homeschool textbooks for Christians in South Africa. We've got such a large homeschool network in South Africa now that we have matric dances, I think you call it the prom, organized by homeschoolers. My oldest daughter, Andrea, was part of the very first homeschool prom in South Africa, and we provide 85% of our book sales from Christian Liberty Books are to homeschoolers, textbooks that we import from America, and some textbooks we produce ourselves. How many people have seen Agenda Masters of Deceit by Curtis Bowers? Well worth seeing this video, absolutely outstanding. It exposes what we're doing today, what we're facing in government. I also helped Jeremiah Films produce 3 different films on Sudan, which we've made available, which is also on our website. And our mission's been operating since 1982. I've worked in 38 countries, traveled in 42 countries, been involved in 8 wars, and our vision is Africa for Christ.